All right, welcome to Let's Talk, the special Christmas edition, it's the Christmas special. So what we're going to discuss today, Gary and I, we're going to discuss monotheism. And so just to bring everybody kind of up to date, monotheism is considered to be the culmination of theistic contributions. The culmination of theistic contributions in the world, and pretty much if you're watching television or watching, CNN style documentaries or something like that, or even especially anything lower education like up to 12th standard, up to high school, we learn that Judaism is the great presenter of monotheism. Monotheism basically means the worship of one supreme divinity, either as above all other divinities or being the only divinity. And along with Judaism come two other religions in the Western world, which are known as the Abrahamic religions, because they all come out of the house of Abraham. And those are the Christians and the Mohammedans, or the what is the proper word?
Muslims.
Muslims don't like being called Mohammedans, so we shouldn't say that. The Muslims, the Christians, and what we call the Jews today are all from the house of Abraham. And they are all monotheistic, although these three religions intensely disagree with one another. They may agree on certain points, certainly the monotheistic point they agree on, but they disagree on many other points. So anyway, we're not going to get into that, but we're going to discuss, is this a fact? Is this a fact? Did monotheism actually come to the world from Judaism, then, of course, adopted by Christianity, which is considered a Jewish heresy, and then another 500 years on or so after that, by Muhammad and the establishment of Islam? Is that a fact? Well, it turns out that's not a fact. The Jews are not the forefathers or the founding fathers of monotheism, neither the Christians nor the Mohammedans. Monotheism first appears in India, and it's recognized in Rig Veda that above all the gods is Vishnu, the supreme being. But it's only when one gets into a deeper study of religion that one actually begins to find out some of the truths about religion. So I'm going to summarize how monotheism comes to the Middle East, and then of course spreads to Europe and the rest of the world that we know as the Western world. I'm going to summarize that. And Gary Maharaj, you're going to provide some of the details, some of the names, some of the details. But I'm going to first give an overview. Now, a scholar might pick at what I'm saying because I may not have the dates correct and this and that. That's always my great defect, is I fail to get all the dates exactly correct. Well, I'm not lecturing. I'm not speaking to the scholars. I'm speaking to the laymen's, lay Christians, and I'm speaking to members of the Krishna conscious community, and particularly members of our own community. So this all begins, we go all the way back to the Rig Veda. And in the Rig Veda, there's a description of two brothers. Giri, their names are?
Jaruta and Vashishta.
Vashishta. So Vashishta Muni, most of us are familiar with because he appears in many places throughout either Mahabharata or Ramayana and or both or whatever. It's one of the famous rishis, Vashishta Muni. Well, Vashishta Muni and this Jaruta, they were half brothers. Giri, is there anything you say how they are half brothers, common mother, different fathers?
They have a common mother, Actually, no. So they have a different, same father, different mother. This is mentioned in the Bhavishya Purana. There's a lot of Jaruta's name is referred to as Jara Shabda in the Vedas, but the whole story of how he became who he is mentioned in the Bhavishya Purana.
All right. So Rig Veda, Bhavishya Purana, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens? I'm going to summarize. These two brothers differed on the Vedic point of view. And Vashishta, basically they had a debate. Maybe it was one single debate over a period of time. And in the end, Vishvamrita, he prevailed in the debate. Well, in those days, if you lost the debate, you have one of two choices. Surrender to the winner or pack your bags and leave. So, Jaruta, what's his name again?
Jaruta.
Mm-hmm. Jaruta packed his bags and he left. And he went to the area of the world which we now call Persia. And he struggled there for some time, but eventually the story and he becomes known as Zoroaster from this time on. Mm. He becomes known as Zoroaster, and he becomes the father of Zoroastrianism. Is there another name for that religion, Gary? Zoroastrianism?
Oh, they call it Parsiism as well.
Parsiism, the Zoroastrian faith.
Yeah.
And they are known today primarily as fire worshippers, etc. But that's really not the most accurate representation of the Zoroastrian religion. In their theistic view, Ahura Mazda is the supreme deity. So what Zoroaster did, well, the story, it's not important, but it's one of those stories where the king's daughter was sick and no one could cure her, and then he cured the king's daughter of her ailment. There are variations to this story, and the king, in gratitude, then accepted Zoroaster into his court, and then gradually the theology of Zoroaster began to prevail until it prevailed the whole of what we know in history to be the Persian Empire. And this spanned, according to, who was it, the Greek philosopher?
I believe it's Plato. Plato or Pythagoras. Yeah.
Pythagoras or Plato attributes Zoroaster as being 7,000 years prior to his time.
Right.
And his time was well over 2,000 years ago. So we're talking Zoroaster minimally, according to a Greek record, is about 9,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. All right. So, so then he established what we now know as the Zoroastrian faith. And in that, Ahura Mazda is the supreme being. But an interesting thing is that he took many of the same divinities from India, for example, Indra or Surya, the sun god, Indra, etc., and he reversed the roles of many of them. In other words, he considered in India, the Asuras are usually the bad guys, and the Devas are the good guys. Well, it's not really good and evil. It has to do with many more things than that divides an Asura. An Asura isn't necessarily a bad person, humanistically speaking, but they do not recognize a supreme being. And Asuras, any person who worships the demigods as supreme beings, or that position is being shared by many gods, is an Asura. Asura isn't always just some fang-bearing, evil, blood-sucking demon, right? But what he did is he reversed the roles, and the good guys were the Asuras, and the bad guys were the Devas. And from this Zoroastrian view, and the word Deva, meaning the bad guys, etymologically, the word devil comes from Deva. And that reminds me of when in Rath Yatra in Los Angeles, the Christians used to get on the side of the Rath Yatra when it would go by, and they'd have their placards, and they were hurling insults at Jagannath, and one of them would be devil worshippers, worshiping the devil. And we used to laugh and go, yeah, that's actually true if you take the etymology of the word devil, comes from the word Deva, and we're worshiping Deva Jagatpate, the supreme Deva. So yeah, I guess you're right, you know. But anyway, so the Persian Empire ended up being one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen in terms of its longevity, how long it lasted, and the area which it covered. And gradually, this Persian Empire, with Zoroastrianism as their main theology, began to push westward. And they pushed westward all the way to Egypt, including almost all of the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, all those places, and Israel. And as they went westward, they encountered the Babylonian Empire. Well, at that time, a little prior to the Babylonians had invaded, defeated one of the, what we call the tribes of Israel, and packed off whatever royalty they didn't execute, they packed off into slavery and drug them out of Israel to Babylon. And for a long time, a century at least, I think, but that may vary. Don't hold me to that century. But for a long time, this particular tribe of Israelites were not allowed to return. They were in slavery in Babylon. So when Cyrus the Great, the Persian, when he captured Babylon, he set the Jews that were enslaved. They weren't called Jews, actually. The Israelites that were there in slavery, he allowed them to go back to Israel. And this Cyrus is mentioned in the Old Testament Bible, which is a summary of the Torah, the Jewish Torah, the Old Testament. What'd you say?
I didn't say anything.
Okay. I thought you said something. So, Cyrus is the Great there. And Cyrus the Great missed by only one qualification as being recognized as the Messiah of the people of Israel. He fulfilled every qualification of the Messiah except one. And that is, he wasn't born in the house of David. He wasn't born an Israelite. Otherwise, what we call the Jewish Messiah has so many things that he has to fulfill. And Cyrus the Great fulfilled all of those things, except he wasn't born in the house of David. So he is recognized as first among, what do they call them? Righteous infidels or something like that.
Righteous Gentiles, I guess.
Yeah, righteous Gentiles. He's first among righteous Gentiles. Later, thousands of years later, in Germany, you have Schindler. If you've seen Spielberg's film, The Schindler List, he's also recognized by the Jewish and Israeli country as the righteous Gentile. All right, so at that time, then monotheism was introduced to the people of Israel, and they weren't called Jews. That the terminology, we just looked up that this morning. When did this particular religious belief, when did they become known as Jews? And
that was more the Middle Ages.
In the Middle Ages.
Europe.
Otherwise, prior, if you said something about a Jew, people would go, "Who's that?" Or "What's that?" You see?
They called themselves Yahudi, and from Yahudi became corrupted to the word Jew.
Yes. So now they're called, nobody knows, if you said that my neighbor's a Yahudi, we go, "What's a Yahudi?" You know? So, now, what's interesting is not only were they not called Jews, they were not monotheistic. They were polytheistic, and that polytheistic means they worshipped more than one supreme being. Archaeological records and even written records that survived from those ancient times till now in the Middle East show that they worship male and female divinities together. And don't anybody say, "Oh, they were worshiping Radha Krishna or Lakshmi Narayan." It's like, nope, they weren't worshiping Radha Krishna. They're not Vaishnavas. They were not worshiping Lakshmi Narayan. But they did worship male and female deities. And it's also noted that these people of Israel were quite prone to human sacrifice, and particularly the sacrifice of little children at the temple of Moloch. And the temple of Moloch was situated in the valley of Hinnon, which is about 25 kilometers. You can walk there in a brisk morning walk from Jerusalem.
Mm.
And it was the place of human sacrifice. And later on in Jewish history, in what they call the period of the rabbis, the beginning of the rabbinical period, the rabbis are writing, coaxing the people of Israel, it's really not necessary to do these human sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
And not only is that there, but in the Old Testament Bible, which is a summary of the Torah, there are several references to human sacrifices. And one of the famous ones, of course, God stops it. I forget who it is, commands him to sacrifice his son as a burnt.
Oh, that was Abraham. That was Abraham.
To sacrifice one of his son, Ishmael or Isaac.
Isaac. Yeah.
Isaac as a human sacrifice. And just at the last minute, God changes his mind. But he's got him right on the altar and he's getting ready to slit his throat. And then God changes his mind. But there are other stories in the Old Testament Bible and in the Torah where God didn't change his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one very, very famous one. What was his name?
Jephthah.
Jephthah. Mm-hmm. Jephthah was an Israelite who was fighting the Ammonites. And so he prayed to God, to Yahweh, and he said that if I win victory in this battle, then I promise you I will offer in burnt sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house when I return home after the battle. Now, maybe the guy had some pigs. No, he didn't have any pigs. He might have had some goats and some horses and some
sheep,
cows. But I don't know what they would have been doing in his house. But anyway, in those days, farmers used to keep the animals in their house too. But in that house also, he had his wife and his children. So he just said to God, whatever comes out of my door first, if it's a chicken, you got it, Lord. Gonna cut that chicken, blood sacrifice, burn him on the altar, and send him up to you. So he wins the battle. This story is in the Old Testament Bible. You can find it just through the right.
Book of Judges.
Huh?
Book of Judges.
Yes, in the Book of Judges. So he wins the battle. He comes home, and guess what? It's not a chicken. It's not a dog. It's not his horse that runs out to meet him. It's his teenage daughter. And she burst out the door, Papa, Papa, and runs and embraces her father who's come back from the battle alive and victorious. So, what's his name again? Jephthah? Jephthah. So, Jephthah then keeps his promise to Yahweh. And he sends his daughter with a bunch of her girlfriends to some mountain retreat where she goes there to kind of make her personal peace with God and try to probably figure out what in the heck is going on.
Was that free range?
Free range, you know. So after 1 year, then she returns and he offers his daughter to Yahweh in burnt sacrifice. So if you have any doubt about what this burnt sacrifice means, look it up in the history books. It's a blood sacrifice where then the body of the sacrifice victim, whether it's a goat or a chicken or whatever, or a human, whatever it is then burned to ashes.
Mm-hmm.
He then offers his daughter up in the burnt sacrifice. And then the story continues that for many years henceforward, the people of that village would honor that day, the day that Jephthah offered his daughter to Yahweh in blood sacrifice. So at that time, God didn't say, Jephthah, it's all right. I thought maybe a goat was coming out of your house and, No, his daughter came out. So nowadays in the modern world, especially the preachers and the clerics, they've done all within their power to bury these things and say, well, it's allegorical, it's this and that. And it's like, sorry, it's not allegorical.
Mm-hmm.
So not only were they not monotheistic, not only they were polytheistic, they did frequently human sacrifice. And according to the records, sometimes up to 100 children or more would be sacrificed to the god Moloch in a single day. So years ago in India, a friend of mine, Haridas Babaji Maharaj, who's a devotee originally from Hawaii, we had a little time on our hands and we were doing some research, and he came to me one day and he says, I have a feeling that this word malecha that we find written in certain places, and certainly it's used by devotees today, he said, I have a feeling, and he says, I'm not a scholar or anything, I just have a feeling that this refers to the worshippers of Moloch. And basically, malecha means unclean peoples. So I said, might be, but speculation. Neither one of us are Sanskrit scholars, so we'll just sit on it. Well, a couple of months later, the Sanskrit, this is over 10 years ago, the Sanskrit scholars of the world finally figured it out, that this word malecha is not a pure Sanskrit word. It's a Semitic word that has been Sanskritized, and it's a derivative from the word Moloch, and Moloch, and it means the worshippers of the god of human child sacrifice. So I thought, wow. And our listeners, you can look that up now. Just look up this word and etymologically, and you'll find that the word malecha is not a Sanskrit word. It's a Semitic language word, and it's been Sanskritized. Now, I'm not a grammarian. I don't know all the details. Look it up yourself, and you'll see this is a fact. So not only, again, I'll say, not only they were not monotheistic, they were polytheistic, and not only that, they were very fond of human sacrifice. So the idea today, where you hear the great contribution to the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as they brought monotheism to the world, this is false. You could even say this is a lie.
I also want to point out one thing.
What?
I also wanted to just point out that Yahweh, who was the god of the Jews, also happened to have a wife, Ashtari.
Ashtari,
yeah.
And this is not Radha and Krishna. And what does Prabhupada, our Guru Maharaj, write in his books? These are the religions of the malechas. Now I just gave you the etymological connection. What is malecha? These are the religions of the people who worshipped Moloch in the ancient world. These are the peoples of human sacrifice in the ancient world. Rampant. Hundreds in a day sometime. And it wasn't just Israel. It was all through the Mediterranean, and especially in Carthage.
Yeah.
I think that's modern day Tunisia. In Carthage, they have found the places of the temples of Moloch there, and the bones of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of children have been burned in sacrifice to this god of malechas, Moloch. So monotheism is taken from India by Zoroaster to what became known as Persia, and he established the monotheism there, and then it spread to the Middle East, and from the Middle East it was adopted by the Jews. There are many things about Judaism, current day Christianity, that don't make a whole lot of sense. For example, Moses on Mount Sinai, he's up there to receive the 10 Commandments, and all of a sudden there's a burning bush. It's just like, what does a burning bush have to do with anything? Burning fire, that's associated with the devil himself and eternal damnation. But suddenly on this day, God decided to speak through a burning bush. Well, this is the Zoroastrian influence at the time, because fire is considered the purest of elements, and thus fire is considered a representation of the divine. Therefore, fire is not used to burn bodies. Cremation is not part of the Zoroastrian theology, because the purest thing should not be used for such an abomination as to burn a human body. And actually, when we start to look at the stories of both that are there in the Torah, Old Testament, and New Testament Bible, particularly when you get to the New Testament, every single story that there is to tell about Jesus is stolen from some other cultural and religious tradition, and some of them stolen from thousands of years before. Everything from stealing from the story of Krishna and the birth of Krishna and the persecution of the children by Kamsa. Stories are stolen from the Greeks. Stories are stolen from the Persians. Stories are stolen from the Buddhists. They amalgamated, and it's just rather strange that all these stories, and there isn't one. You can, if you're listening out there and you think this isn't right, then you please mail us a story about Jesus, and we'll show you where it came from. Thousands of years, hundreds of years, and thousands of years before Jesus. So it's very strange that such a person who is supposed to have walked on the earth wouldn't have any original stories of his own. Walking on water, been there and done that. Another story, another rishi, another god of Israel, or not Israel, of Egypt, or the Greek gods or the Persian gods. Everything, absolutely every single story has been borrowed. Now, we're going to get to that book in a minute, Gary. There was what was his name? Robert something?
Robertson. His name was John M. Robertson.
And he was a member of British Parliament, I believe.
Yes, in the late 19th century.
Late 19th century into the beginning of the early 20th century.
Yes.
And he wrote 2 books extensively. I'm going to flash the books up on the screen for a minute. He wrote 2 books. One of them here is called Christ and Krishna by John M. Robertson. Again, he was a member of Parliament. He was a Scotsman, I believe.
Yes.
But he was a member of the British Parliament. He wrote this book, Christ and Krishna. And then he wrote this book called Christianity and Mythology. Again, that's John M. Robertson, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And in these books, we'll get into a little bit of, he himself, this is 100 years ago, he shows how every story that exists in the Bible today is borrowed from some other, and he refers to it as mythological tradition, dating back thousands of years before Christ, before Jesus. And uniquely, he's very respectful for Krishna, to Krishna in his writing, very respectful. And he says it without a doubt, as if to say, and let there be no doubt about it. The worship of Krishna by the Hindus in India predated the worship of Christ by centuries, if not millennia. So that brings us to another point in this discussion, and that's we've already discussed how propaganda steals the truth. When preaching becomes propaganda, it's not any longer preaching. It's simply propaganda. Whether it's to bolster your society or to bolster your religious point of view as above all others, especially when it's not above others, then people create lies, which then becomes propaganda. And then down the road, the followers, they actually believe that propaganda. And the Krishna consciousness movement faces some of the same difficulties today. Propaganda taking the place of preaching, bending the facts, creating false information in order to curb the obedience of the institutional members and so forth. So this begins in our modern world. I'm going to put a little clip here on the thing. It's called ALPHABETUM TIBETANUM Missionum Apostolicarum. This is a book that's written in Latin, and approximately the year, Gary, late 1700s.
1762.
Book is published 1762. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll put this book back up on the screen in a few minutes, but So what this book is, ALPHABETUM TIBETANUM, the story is it's a group of 6 or 8 Jesuit monks who came to India and from India made their way into Tibet. Well, in Tibet in those days, Tibet was a forbidden kingdom. So they snuck into Tibet. And after some years, they were found out, or I don't know how long they stayed in Tibet, I think almost 2 years before they were totally found out. And they, from the authorities in Lhasa, they were kicked out of Tibet. And they went back to India through Nepal. And then they went back to Italy. They went back to Europe, and they were based out of Italy. Now, these monks were all illiterate. They were illiterate, which was very common for the time. That in those days, maybe not even 1 in 100 priests or monks knew how to read. And it might sound strange, but that's actually the fact. The farther time you go back until you could maybe have 500 monks, Christian monks, and only 1 of them know how to read. Nowadays, I think everyone would know how to read, but in those days, not. So they went by and they hired this guy, and he wrote their memoirs in Latin. And basically, what they say is that in India and Tibet, there are 2 great religions. There are 2 very great religions. It means they're great for the countries they're in. And that's Hinduism and the worship of Krishna, and that's Buddhism and the worship of Buddha. And then they put forward the idea that somehow, we don't know exactly how, but somehow the Bible made its way to India centuries before. And when the people of India got their hands on a Bible and read the Bible, this and then inspired the Vedas and the Puranas. And the story of Krishna was inspired from the Bible. And the story of Buddha was inspired from the Bible. This began an almost 1.5 century theory called the borrowing theory. Now you can look that up, the borrowing theory. If you're watching this video, you look it up. Read a little history of the borrowing theory. And everything, they found so many similarities in the story of Jesus to the story of Krishna. The cowherds, the manger, Kamsa persecuting, right? The children, Herod persecuting the children, killing the children. Stories from the Puranas, the Great Flood, all these things. Mostly about Krishna, but not totally. Buddha, also Buddha is tested. He's out on the desert or somewhere. Buddha's not in the desert, but he's meditating. And there's great tests are placed before him. Similarly, Jesus goes onto the desert and fast, and all these tests are placed before him. So they're saying that all these stories are spawned out of the Bible. And my father used to have a saying, this is like the challenge of making a silk chudder from a pig's tail. It's just not going to happen. These inky-dink little stories in the Bible is inspiring the Vedas and the Puranas and the whole story of Krishna and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. It ain't going to happen in thousands of years. But anyway, being intensely Eurocentric, the people of Europe, and on a colonizing spirit to dominate and own the whole world, well, yeah, this fitted out perfect. And for over 100 years, this theory was the prominent theory in the history of religions, that the religions of Asia, mainly China and Tibet at that time, they are borrowed from Christianity. Gary, you want to, when we say every story, that Robertson, he points out, I mean, he goes through the list and shows this story in Christianity, where it came from in Zoroastrianism or Egypt or Greece or India. Do you have a couple of those on hand? We could share some exact.
it's not only Robertson, and many scholars, both at that time and even in the present now, are finding collaborating stories from much more ancient sources than the Bible. For example, Adam and Eve is directly from the Zendavesta of the Zoroastrians. It's the whole story is there about the Garden of Eden and so on. Eve eating the apple is connected to the Greek myth of Pandora opening the box and letting all the evils out, and the story of Gilgamesh. The flood myth, of course, the oldest flood myth we have is from the Bhagavatam and the Puranas, as Swayambhuva Manu and Matsya Avatar. But there's many, many flood myths all over the world, in Sumeria, Scandinavia, China. The Tower of Babel, in the Ramayana, we find Ravana building a staircase to Swargaloka. Even in Mexico and Mesopotamia, there were very, very similar stories to that. Then they have the concept of the Messiah in Judaism and Christianity, of course, which is directly lifted from the conception of the Sosyant, or the Savior, in Zoroastrianism. The virgin birth, of course, Krishna, the Egyptian god Horus, Herod killing the children, as you mentioned, this from Bhagavatam, Kamsa. Birth on the 25th of December, Mithras and Horus. There's a story of the exorcism in the Gospels. The famous Roman writer Lucian talks about a very famous Syrian miracle worker around the same time did exactly the same thing, driving the pigs off the cliff and everything, raising Lazarus and the dead. That's from Apollonius of Tyana. Also, we have Krishna reviving the sons of Devaki as well, the dead sons of Devaki. The temptation in the wilderness, you mentioned that. Zoroaster, Buddha, the resurrection of a dead god, Osiris, Dionysus. In Mexico, we have Quetzalcoatl. He also came back from the dead. The Day of Judgment, raising of the dead, totally Zoroastrian. So all this and many, many more.
It's not just many, many more. It's all.
Everything.
There's not a single story in the Bible that isn't stolen from some other place. So then that begs the question, well, what did Jesus do on his own? Even what did he say that's original? Is there anything original about Christianity? And the answer is no, there isn't.
One thing.
Oh, that's right. There is one thing original about Christianity that we find nowhere else in the world, and for obvious reasons, but we'll let the obvious reason dawn on our readers or watchers. What is that reason?
That's original sin.
Original sin, yes.
Which came after the Bible with Augustine.
Yeah. That's not even a beginning tenet.
No.
Actually, what first put me on this trail about 30 years ago was when a friend of mine mentioned, we were watching this film. It was a very avant-garde, controversial film called The Last Temptation of Christ. And at one point, Christ is dreaming, and he's walking through the market with his family. And there's a preacher standing up on a pulpit or something. He's standing up on a rock or something, and he's preaching that Jesus died for your sins. And so Jesus comes forward in his dream and he challenges his preacher. He says, that's a lie. I didn't die for your sins. And in this movie, and in the dream of Jesus, this guy runs away and Jesus chases him and he grabs him by the shoulder and he spins him around and says, you're lying. I didn't die for the sins of the world. Why are you saying that? And the person says, it really doesn't matter. The people just need something to believe in. And then he jerks away from Jesus in the dream and he goes off. So I was watching this film with Tripurari Maharaj, and I said, and we stopped. I said, what was that all about? He goes, oh, that's Pauline. That's the injection of Pauline Christianity. And I said, Pauline Christianity? What's that? He goes, well, according to the historical record and scholars, et cetera, is this guy named Saul of Tarsus, right?
Yeah.
Who later became known as Paul. He invented the whole thing. And I went, you're kidding. He goes, no, you should check it out. And so I checked it out in great detail over the years as the facility to research became easier and easier. And now it's extremely easy to research. But, Check your references if you find something online. Don't just believe it first read. But it's amazing. Pauline Christianity. He started the whole story that everybody knows is Jesus. Yeah. So So there were many of these stories were borrowed. But the main thing is we want to say that the concept of monotheism, which is the pinnacle of theistic thought and conception in human society, it is not a gift to the world of Judaism and Christianity. It is a gift to the world that comes from India. And Zoroaster brought it first to Persia, changed things all around, but kept that central concept of a supreme being. And then that was brought by Cyrus and the Persians to Babylon, and then hence into Israel. And then is adopted later by the Christians and also by the Muslims. It's funny if you ask people, what religion was Jesus? It's like, what do you mean, what religion was Jesus? He's a Christian, right? And no, he was a card-carrying member rabbi. He himself was a rabbi. He wore the little thing on the top of his head. He didn't wear a Roman toga, and he didn't have long blonde hair and blue eyes. Like if you go to a local church down here, a Protestant church, and see the picture of Jesus, he's wearing a Roman toga. He's got blonde hair and blue eyes. Nope. Sorry. Very dark eyes, very dark hair, probably very, very curly hair, very ruddy, if not dark complected. You see. So people don't, it's, the Jesus thing, So we were going to discuss in another video, I think we were going to discuss, so I think, is that clear? Is there something else we wanted to add about that, Giri?
Yes.
The monotheism? About
the borrowing theory. And
what changed it? So the borrowing theory got started back there by these Jesuit monks, and this book that I'm going to put back on the screen, this ALPHABETUM TIBETANUM. This started the whole idea, kicked off the idea. See, because when the colonialists, arrived in India and everything in that part of the world, they found many things. They found a superior culture. They found a bewildering history they couldn't figure out. And it was very, very challenging. And this came out, this was a godsend. Oh, yes, these religions that are so much similar and look actually a little superior, we won't mention that, but they're borrowed from Christianity. So the Eurocentric consciousness is seized upon this idea because this gave them, something to chew on, something to fight with.
In other words, they're saying that Christianity predated the worship of Krishna.
Not only predated it, they say that the whole myth of Krishna comes out of the story of Jesus.
Yeah. So
what we're saying is the myth of Jesus came out of the story of Krishna. There's a difference between a story and a myth. All right, so that could be later topics, and I know people's minds are exploding right now. But Prabhupada said Christ and Krishna and Jesus is our guru and he's a pure devotee and all those kind of things. That's a topic for adults who no longer believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. We might get around to that one later on, but for this one, it's just about monotheism and the borrowing theory. So that was in vogue, and being good Hindus at the time in India, there was little to no opposition to this, Hindus have not really been fighters for truth and arguing in courts about Siddhanta since practically the time of, I'd say the last one was Madhvacharya. Madhvacharya preached in the courts of kings. Mahaprabhu didn't. He avoided the courts of kings. Shankaracharya, all these others, there was the debates in before kings in great learned circles. So by the time the borrowing theory arrived in India, the Brahmins had lost their fight. There was little to no fight in them. And they just, they didn't care. Doesn't matter. So, but what happened is the Archaeological Survey of India was established by there was a colonel or a general from the British Army that was
Yeah, Alexander Cunningham.
Alexander Cunningham. He was into getting to the bottom of this history and what's who and what's what and everything. So he's the one that started the Archaeological Survey of India. And in the course of about 10 years, there were some archaeological studies. There was the Pillar of Heliodorus. There were the coins, the Greek coins from the Bactrian, found in Afghanistan. What was that king or general?
Agathocles.
Huh?
Agathocles.
Agathocles.
Yeah.
There was the Moral Well inscription,
Mm-hmm.
and there were the writings of Megasthenes.
Also the Goshundi inscriptions as well.
Goshundi.
Yeah.
There were actually 5 things. 4 of them were stone objects that you can, and metal objects you could put your hands on. And the other, the writing of Megasthenes. Megasthenes was, one of the writers at the time of Alexander. And Alexander's 350 years approximately before the Christ of the Christian religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to show first the Heliodorus pillar, and I'm going to tell a little bit what it is. Then Gary, and you can let me see, where's that photo? Oh no, not that one. Sorry, not that one. This one. This is known as the Heliodorus pillar, and Heliodorus was a Greek ambassador who came to India around 300 BC to the kingdom, I believe it was called Videshi. And
Videshi, yeah.
Videshi. It was near present-day Bhopal. And he was accepted into the court at the time, and he was allowed to be present during a great fire sacrifice and the opening of the temple. This used to be a Garuda Stamba. And an inscription by him was placed on this pillar. Now, this Heliodorus, historically speaking, is considered the first Western Vaishnava, because in the archaeological record, he is the first person from the West to be accepted and to be inside the ritual arena for the fire sacrifice and to be admitted inside of the temple. And the reason was that, well, scholars and researchers determined that the reason was that although he had come now from Greece and India and Greece had been separated for a long time, that they were now called Yavanas, but previously these Yavanas were Kshatriyas. And so he had a bloodline of Kshatriyas, so they allowed him in and whatever the politics of the day. But he's considered the first, considered the first Western Vaishnava. So I'm going to put this Heliodorus, the pillar itself, and you can't really see so much, but here's an inscription. Our viewers can see that now. Gary, you want to tell us a little bit about what that inscription says?
Sure. This is an inscription in Brahmi, which is a derivative of Sanskrit. It was used for most of social things rather than religious things. So in this inscription, it says, "This Garuda column of Vasudev, the god of gods, was erected here by Heliodorus, a worshipper of Vishnu, the son of Dion, and an inhabitant of Takshila, who came as Greek ambassador from the great king Antilochidas to King Kashiputra Bhagabhadra, the savior, then reigning prosperously in the 14th year of his kingship."
Read the first line again.
This Garuda column of Vasudev, the god of gods.
Okay, so that's it.
Mm-hmm.
300 years before Christ, Heliodorus is saying this Garuda pillar dedicated to Vasudev, the god of God. David, Jagatpate. God of God means one supreme being. That's monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an archaeological record for 300 years before Christ. This is monotheism. This is just at the time, around the same time that the Israelites were being set free from slavery in Babylon. You see. So this is all, and what is he quoting there? He's quoting something that is already millennia old in India. This was not like, oh, this is a new idea, Vasudev's David Jagatpate. No, this is around in India. This is the Vedic concept. This is the Rig Veda. Above all is Vishnu. What is the verse? Vishnu Paramam Padam?
Sirapasanti Surya, yeah.
Above all are the lotus feet of Vishnu. Everything is below. Everything is not only below Vishnu, everything is below the lowest part of Vishnu.
Mm-hmm.
The lowest extremity of Vishnu is his lotus feet. All other devas are below that. So that was one, the Heliodorus pillar. And then another very interesting one was this. Where is it? I didn't put it in here yet. Where is it? Aha. Well, I'll just put it on the screen now. There. So now we're looking at, Giddy, our viewers can see the coins. These are the coins of who was it again?
Agathocles.
Agathocles was one of the generals of Alexander who was left behind and to manage and rule over that part of that was conquered which is now Afghanistan, which was conquered by Alexander. He left his agents behind as he went. Well, you take a look at close at this. There are two figures. This is the same coin front and back. On the one side is Lord Balaram holding the plow, and on the other side is Lord Krishna holding the chakra. So, again, this goes back around 3000 BC, coins with Krishna and Balaram. So not only, because someone say, well, Vasudeva means Vishnu, whatever. Krishna and Balaram, like in Raman Reti, Krishna Balaram temple in Raman Reti. Balaram's carrying a plow. Krishna's carrying the chakra. These coins were minted 3 centuries before anybody even thought the name of the Christian God, you see. So again, that proved it. And then these others we don't have pictures of, but there were 3 others and 2 other archaeological discoveries. The Mora well inscription, the other one you mentioned.
Yeah, the Goshundi inscriptions.
Goshundi inscriptions and the writings of Megasthenes.
Mm-hmm.
And Megasthenes talks about, anyway. So these 5 things then proved, and I think it was something like 1903, around that time, it was written into the Oxford Book of Religious Histories, the Oxford Book of World History in the Religious History section, that the worship of Krishna, Vasudeva Krishna, predated the worship of Jesus Christ by at least 3 centuries. So, thus ended the era of the borrowing theory. But once again, being good Hindus, those Brahmins, they didn't say, well, let's just hold the phone here for a minute. You showed all these similarities, and you wanted to say that the worship of Krishna was adopted, borrowed from the worship of Jesus, but now that's been proven wrong. So maybe, just maybe we should have a look at the possibility that Christianity, the character Jesus, the worship of Jesus, and all these things is actually borrowed from the story of Krishna. Mm-hmm. But being good Hindus, they didn't do that. But being good researchers, people like our John Robertson, he wrote several books. These are 2 that we found recently, where he shows the parallels and establishes that the onus is on the Christian community to prove, not just to say, but to prove that they did not borrow in antiquity the stories of Krishna and just apply them to this personality who became known as Jesus Christ. But you know what happens so often? Scholars discover truth. They write huge books about it, theses on theses of truth. Then they publish it, they stick it on a library shelf somewhere, and no one ever sees it, no one ever reads it. Then on the other hand, somebody publishes a book which is a pack of lies, basically, and preaches it with hellfire and brimstone from the pulpit, and the whole world accepts it. This is the material world, you know. So not only did Judaism and Christianity and Islam get monotheism from India, they also borrowed many of their quintessential stories, which are supposed to prove the divinity of their Messiah or the divinity of their God. They borrowed these from the story of Krishna and augmented it also with other stories. And the funny thing is, many of them are taken from this fall theory that the living beings of this world fall from a state of divine grace to this world. That's Zoroastrian. That comes from the Zoroastrian creed, not from the Vedic creed. And so, just for the record, and we're going to do a video on this in a few days called Other Influences in the Krishna Consciousness Movement, and we're going to focus on particularly the Christian influences in the Krishna Consciousness Movement, and that will include the fall theory, that all these living entities, of which there are hundreds of millions and billions, just in the town of Burlington, Vermont, where I am right now, counting every bird, every insect, every amoeba, every microscopic germ, they were all pure devotees in the spiritual world, and they fell from this divine grace to this material world, and all those other, there isn't even a number to begin to tell us how many living beings there are in this one planet, what to speak of this one universe, and there are multiple universes, and all of these beings fell from a position of having been eternally in love with Krishna, but one day they just became overwhelmed with envy and fell into this material world. This idea comes from Zoroastrianism. It was then augmented or implemented into Judaism, I don't know about the Jews, but the Christians.
Christians for sure.
Christians for sure. We didn't look at really, what did the Mohammedans say? But they're all similar.
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually a Christian Zoroastrian influence in the Hare Krishna movement. It is not a Vedic fact. It is not a Vedic fact, and it doesn't matter what way you want to try to juggle it. No Acharya will agree with you. No Acharya anywhere in any Sampradaya will agree that we came from the eternal Vaikuntha or the eternal Goloka. It is a Zoroastrian and a Christian influence in the Hare Krishna movement. So there are many such influences, unfortunately, today. There are Sahajya influences, there are Jewish influences, there are Christian influences, there are Buddhist influences. It is just amazing when we started writing these down, what communities of devotees believe, what even sannyasis and gurus preach in the name of Krishna consciousness, and how much of that isn't Krishna consciousness at all. It's simply the influence of their prior Sukritis. Not Sukriti, their prior sanskar. In other words, what they used to be, or what's around them today in the world. Not Krishna consciousness, outside influences. So stay with us next week, I think after the holidays.
Holy days.
The holidays, really. Ask your friends about how do you spell holiday, and they'll spell Holiday. That's not Hala, that's holy. It's supposed to be holy days. So, we live in a fool's paradise. And the more and more we wake up to that, the more shocking what that actually means, how deep that runs. Fool's paradise. So anyway, that's our Christmas special for this year. A little explanation, a little history about the most wonderful gift to the world of theistic thought, monotheism. It comes from India, it comes from the Vedas, and it comes from the story of Krishna above all. Giri, anything else to add?
No.
All right. Until next week, Hare Krishna, everyone. Hare Krishna.